Wow, look at that Zoom crowd. Man.
Okay, well, let's get started. Welcome to everyone on Zoom. We've got a big crowd on Zoom today. Audio turn on. All right, well, welcome back. I'm Zach Lesser. I know most people here, but I'm in the English department, and I co-organized the seminar along with John Pollock of the Kislak Center, Jerry Singerman, emeritus from the Penn Press, and Lila Goldenberg, our Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Text, who makes all the logistics happen, and is sending around our sign-in sheet so that you can let us know you're here and put your email on there if you'd like to get on our mailing list. People on Zoom, the chat should be open. You can chat in there, you can write questions in there, and you can also use the raise hand function during Q&A, and we'll call on you to ask your question live. Okay, so I think it's been a great semester so far. Future talks should also be excellent. We've got coming up, we've got voice letters, kosher butcher's guides, artist books, and the post office, among many other things. And I was looking at the list, and I actually think this semester, really without it being planned by us in this way, really exemplifies both the range of the kind of work in this workshop and also the unexpected overlaps and cross-pollinations between the talks that I've always loved about it. And we've got one of those totally unplanned overlaps, I think, tonight and next week, thinking about the relationship between speech and writing in two very different contexts. So next week, Thomas Levin of Princeton will talk about gramophonic voice letters. You'll have to tune in to find out what that means next week. And tonight, we're excited to host Andras Kizri talking about recording speech in 17th century England. Andras is Associate Professor of English at City College of New York, the basketball powerhouse of the United States in 1949 to 50. In case you didn't know, they became the only team, still the only team to win both the NCAA and NIT tournaments in the same year. So I just wanted to throw that in there for you basketball fans. Andras did not play college basketball, as far as I know, at Eötvös University in Budapest. And then he received his master's at the University of Bristol in 1995 and his PhD from Columbia in 2008. Andras's work on early modern drama thinks broadly about the relationship of form, both literary and material, and politics. His first book was Hamlet's Moment, Drama and Political Knowledge in Early Modern England, published by Oxford in 2016. The title of the book plays on Pocock's landmark Machiavellian moment, as Andras explores the turning point in the history of early modern drama when, as he puts it, the business of politics became a matter of dramatic representation. In so doing, the London stages functioned as a public media that brought political analysis, conflict, and insight to a broad audience. As one reviewer wrote in Shakespeare Quarterly, the ambitiousness of this book cannot be overstated, nor can its contribution to the field. Andras's attention to dramatic form in this book was accompanied by his edited collection with Alison Duderman, Formal Matters, Reading the Materials of English Renaissance Literature, from Manchester in 2013. And I think there's a through line there to his current work on media studies and the humanities. This work includes a special issue of Modern Language Quarterly on new media and the humanities, 1900 to 1960, as well as his book in progress, which is called Media Histories, the Humanities and the Challenge of New Communication Technologies, 1900 to 1943. Andras is also working on another monograph for which he's received funding from the NEH called Books in Space, Forming English Literature in the Early Modern World, which traces the circulation of English lit across continental Europe in the period. And in addition to a host of articles in ELH, Philological Quarterly, and elsewhere, he also publishes in Hungarian on both early modern and Hungarian literature, and has translated the work of David Scott Kasten into Hungarian. I couldn't leave out. I saw an earlier version of this talk at the Shakespeare Association of America conference last spring, and it was, as the kids say, an absolute banger. And I knew we should get him to present on it here, so I'm really glad he said yes. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Oh yeah, thank you, Zach, so much, and thank you guys for having me. It's really genuinely an honor and also a pleasure to be here. This is such an amazing thing. This seminar, like I came a few times, and also like looked at some of the talks on Zoom. It's just a fantastic thing, and I wish I was like, so living so close that I could come every week. I wanted to talk about a connection between early modern drama and early modern shorthand, and I want to talk about it from a perspective that's not how we normally talk about this connection, which is basically shorthand note-taking as a source of some of the texts that got published. Instead of that, I want to start with, okay, so how does this move forward? Okay, it's not moving. I did. Oh, you mean, but there's also, it also doesn't show up there. Just to move this.
Yeah.
Oh, so we had a. Okay. Okay, so I will just need to scroll. Okay, sorry. So I'm just going to be doing this. So I'm sorry. So something strange was happening around 1600 in printed English drama. Plays were making a remarkable effort at the written representation of all the noise characteristic of embodied speech. This is a moment when characters in playbooks begin to speak in recognizable dialects and accents, or use colloquial expressions and slang. And some characters also begin to sound like actual speakers in other ways as well. Their lines display various non-fluences, written representations of involuntary moments of spoken language. So they stammer and stutter, they lose their thread and stop mid-sentence, they repeat themselves, they interrupt each other. We even see vocalized pauses. And of course, usually this kind of representation of embodied speech usually means an effort to mock, condemn, or at least to condescend. Now, and once again, I need to try and move this switch. Okay, here we go. So I had just a couple of samples of this. So it's mostly Johnson and Marston whom I'm using here. So you see the character La Foule and him going, I'll in. What's the matter? Here, again, from Epicene, you see a moment of somebody coughing. That's obviously the V is a U there. You see this passage again from Epicene with all the interruptions that the dashes represent. Here you have a moment when the mocking of somebody's stammer is actually like highlighted by the dialogue when somebody's mocking the person and mimicking their stammer, and then yes, thus mock me. And I want to just finish on this one, which is probably kind of the most elaborate, the longest of these attempts at somebody speaking both with a foreign accent and having a difficulty uttering the beginning of words. So Johnson and Marston are perhaps the two writers who make the most radical effort at this kind of very similar scripting of the noise of embodied speech. But the phenomenon is present to some degree throughout the corpus of early 17th century drama. Even Shakespeare scripted loosely conversational dialectal lines lines that produce character not only through literary style, but more specifically through conveying or signaling the physical embodied qualities of the utterance. Now, Marshall McLuhan is famous, among other things, for insisting that the content of a medium is always another medium. He also repeatedly made the seemingly commonsensical point that the content of writing is speech, or in a different formulation, that the content of the book is speech. But as we know, the primary and usual function of writing is not the reproduction of speech. If by speech we mean spoken utterance that emerges in interaction among people. In this sense, most books do not contain speech at all. In his effort to align writing with such media as the radio, the telephone, or the gramophone, McLuhan reduced written communication to yet another technology for the transmission of speech, and chose to ignore the majority of written texts that are in fact born written, composed using the slow, reflexive, iterative technology of writing itself. So to make a simple distinction here, while all writing can be seen as the container of speech insofar as it can be read out loud, there is a particular and rather fascinating subset of written texts that attempt to remediate speech as spoken utterance. People have always lived surrounded by spoken language, of course. So what sensitized playwrights to the characteristics of embodied speech at this moment? Dramatic dialogue does not have to read and sound like improvised embodied speech at all. And in most cases in the history of the form, it also does not. So what did suddenly enable prose, the prose of comedy, to remediate speech together with the noise that is native to and characteristic of it? To register all the various ways in which someone's desire to communicate may come up against the spoken medium and against the limitations of their own ability to control the medium. Marston's script from the early 1600s might seem to anticipate a kind of mimetic spelling early 20th century figures are working with. Here you see Joyce in 1922 imagining an old man speaking through a gramophone recording from the grave in Dublin, or Claude McKay in 1928, recreating not only the dialect of his characters living in Harlem, but also choosing a more very similar alternative to the conventionalized ha-ha to represent the laughter, presumably of a heavy smoker, by the way. Such modernist experimentation with the representation of the sound of the vernacular is often linked with the emergence of the new media of the late 19th and early 20th century in criticism, and with their impact on the phenomenology of orality. According to media critics who were contemporaries of Joyce and McKay, these technologies split sound from the rest of the sensorium. They disembody and thus defamiliarize the voice, making speech and its noise newly audible. One of the most powerful analyses of the impact of new technological media on the perception of speech is, I think, the famous scene in Proust's The Guermantes Way, where Marcel makes a phone call and hears the voice of his grandmother, a voice he obviously knows very well, as if for the first time. The experience is disturbing. When the call is connected, instead of the comfort of familiarity, he gets something new and unfamiliar. I suddenly heard that voice, which I mistakenly thought I knew so well. For always until then, every time that my grandmother had talked to me, I had been accustomed to follow what she said on the open score of her face, in which the eyes figured so largely. But her voice itself, I was hearing this afternoon for the first time. So as the telephone abstracts the voice, it defamiliarizes it, which in turn enables the narrator not only to discover for the first time how sweet that voice was, but also without the mask of her face, I noticed for the first time the sorrows that had cracked it in the course of a lifetime. Proust writes for the first time 3 times within the same long paragraph. This is a classic instance of what Viktor Shklovsky calls ostranenie, defamiliarization, the aesthetic effect of breaking routinized perception and making us perceive something afresh and for real. In his famous essay, Art as Device or Art as Technique, written between 1917 and 1919, exactly in the years when Proust was writing Le Côté de Guermantes. Shklovsky talks about Tolstoy's achievement in being able to describe an object as if he were seeing it for the first time. My point is that new media can do exactly that. Proust's analysis of the aesthetic function of the telephone, published in 1920, is an early instance of the kind of commentary that was flourishing in the interwar years. In his 1936 book, Rudolf Arnheim wrote that by separating sound from other senses, radio emancipates sound from the body. It artificially cuts out slices of reality, by this isolation making them the object of special attention, sharpening acoustic powers of observation. Arnheim's book is an instance of modernist media analysis, which works by isolating the medium-specific qualities and characteristics of a cultural phenomenon as a starting point for their exploration. I want to use this single-mindedness of early 20th century media criticism for the perspective it can provide on the medial conditions of 17th century writing. So what are the aspects of the early 17th century mediascape that may be relevant here? On the one hand, the medium in which speech is inscribed. Over the course of the 16th century, vernacular prose was becoming increasingly standardized and therefore increasingly capable of distinguishing the noise originating in a different medium, i.e., it was more and more capable of remediating the qualities characteristic of the medium of speech. On the other hand, around the turn of the century, several new speech-oriented cultural techniques converged and intersected with the prose medium. And like Marcel's telephone or Arnheim's radio, they contributed to a defamiliarization of speech in the classic formalist sense of the term, that is to say, created a newly acute aesthetic awareness of speech. First and most obviously, perhaps, the playbook as a cultural technology for conveying stage dialogue and stage action in textual form is beginning to consolidate around 1600. These conventions include not only the arrangement of speech prefixes and stage directions, but also the use of dashes for interrupted utterances. The second cultural technology is the multilingual conversation manual or phrasebook. Of these, perhaps paradoxically, Latin phrasebooks are not only the most common, but also the most radically oriented towards vernacular speech. They use snippets taken from Latin comedy as models for Latin speech and attempted to pair them with their apt idiomatic English equivalents. This procedure meant that while the Latin colloquial phrases often lifted from the comedies of Terence were stable and codified, the phrasebook authors had to collect lively idiomatic English equivalents from vernacular conversation around them. It is rather remarkable how rich the English side of some of these English-Latin manuals can be, and I'm sorry about this horrible red that I'm using. So John Palsgrave's conversation manual version of the Neo-Latin comedy Aqualastus is a good example. So here is how he renders a part of an exchange. On the left, the Latin, on the right, a choice of colloquial English equivalents. And I transcribed this because the print is just so dense that it would be hard to parse it. But you see that you have like 4 equivalents for that 3-word phrase. I mean, it would be very difficult to argue that this exercise is primarily about the Latin. There is something else going on. But I want to focus on a third technology today, and it's shorthand. The time when Johnson and Marston were writing, shorthand was the hot new media technology for the recording of spoken language. Invented around the turn of the century, new alphabetic shorthand systems worked partly through designing new alphabets consisting of minimalistic characters, and partly through streamlining the script by abandoning traditional orthography, dropping letters that were not sounded, and by reducing letter combinations to single signs, thus trying to achieve what we would call, oops, sorry. Oh, it works like this as well. Okay. Reducing letter combinations to single signs, are trying to achieve what we would call a closer equivalency between phonemes and graphemes. Although they were not phonetic but alphabetic, They were using crude phonetic principles to abbreviate spelling. And this was what made them capable of recording not only the keywords of a speech, not only the conceptual skeleton of what was being said, as in earlier logographic systems of abbreviated note-taking, but theoretically at least every word and every sound of it. As John Willis, the author of the earliest such shorthand system, explained, this art prescribeth the writing of words not according to their orthography as they are written, but according to their sound as they are pronounced. And here's another slide from 1633 shorthand manual, which kind of indicates like, just how you are supposed to be doing this. Histories of early 17th century shorthand often isolate the new technology from the intellectual context Willis was gesturing at by when he was using the term orthography. Here I'm kind of using something that I was looking at here at the Kislak Center earlier today. Can you guess what that is? That's not a W. That's an omega. And this is not in English. This is in Italian. So orthography as a cultural technique, which was hotly debated across Europe in the period. This is like from 1529, Trissino's play Sophonisba, where he's trying to kind of show and introduce a new Italian orthography that actually distinguishes between two kinds of E and two kinds of O. So this is not just like some kind of a typographic fancy, but if you see, you can look for the distinctions. And so that reki there is orecchie, right? And this is just the opening of your copy of Trissino. Now, the late 16th and early 17th century saw a series of proposals for the rationalization of English spelling. Although in the end, a traditionalist, etymologically grounded spelling won out over the radical phonetic ideas, the proponents of a spelling reform, who were following in the footsteps of French proposals for phonetic spelling, were often remarkably sophisticated in their analysis of the system of English phonemes. John Hart, in his book published in 1569, although there's a manuscript from 51, insists that writing should have as many letters as the speech has voices, no more nor less. His reformed orthography attempts a strictly phonetic script, operating with a modified and expanded Latin alphabet. And his book actually shows his own reformed orthography in action. An exercise of that which is said, wherein is declared how the rest of the consonants are mad by the instruments of the mouth. Right? Hart is usually thought to be the most radical figure in this story, his work coming remarkably close to the analysis of modern phonetics. The great early 20th century linguist Otto Jespersen thought that he was the first phonetician. But this is not a mid-16th century tradition only. I mean, William Bullokar's works are from the 1580s, while Alexander Gill, on the slide, published his Logonomia Anglica in 1619, which is a grammar and rhetoric illustrated with passages from Spenser, transcribed into Gill's phonetic alphabet. Now, much of what we know about early modern pronunciation does in fact derive from this work. But historians of English pronunciation have also used the evidence from various shorthand systems, which often turn out to be very simple versions of these scholarly proposals. And while spelling reformers' tracts circulated in few editions, primarily among members of a scholarly community, shorthand manuals went through dozens of editions, reaching an incredibly wide audience. Just how seriously they took the potential of shorthand for phonetic representation is indicated by the attempts to use it for recording the languages of the native populations of New England colonies. We know shorthand was used to record dialectal speech in the 19th century, but this was already attempted in the 17th, and not just with dialects of English, but as I said, also with non-Indo-European languages. Now, the fact that these attempts seem to have failed does not make any difference to my point here, which is that people thought that they were capable of this. Shorthand notation complements phonetic representation with speed. Shorthand attempts to register speech not only as an utterance, but as an event, not what the text would sound like, but what it actually sounded as. For reasons that I'm very eager to speculate about and also to discuss with you during Q&A, the first such modern shorthand systems were invented in England, and until the 19th century, it was in English-speaking lands that they were most widespread. Throughout the 17th century, travelers coming from the continent were struck by how obsessed the English seemed to be with the technology. And I just wanted to kind of acknowledge a seminar I took a long time ago with John and Roger Chartier, where I think Roger mentioned shorthand as this interesting technology, and then we didn't have like a longer conversation about it, but I think that was the moment where I first like thought about this. People were eager to show off their skill in public. The sermons of popular preachers were often attended by avid note takers. A surprising number of people paid stenographers to teach them shorthand, and shorthand manuals were published in dozens of editions, which indicates the fascination, although not necessarily a generally high level of competence. The success and spread of the technology shows that it offered a solution for a problem of early modern society, namely the need to be able to capture, record, and archive speech in writing, and preferably not just the gist of what was being said. For a documentary culture that valorized the written record of a spoken utterance over its mere memory, it was especially important to have verbatim record of momentous statements. This is what all systems of shorthand promised: the ability to record sermons, court testimonies, parliamentary proceedings, and perhaps even play performances exactly as they were uttered. This last, writing down plays from performance, is the use of shorthand people working on early modern English literature are most likely to have encountered. In recent years, a series of scholars have revisited the question how shorthand note-taking may have influenced the transmission of play texts. But research on this topic, research on this topic really flourished in the 19th and early 20th century. That is, at the time when the use of shorthand was also incredibly widespread. That's the New York Public Library's printed catalog of their shorthand collection. It's over 600 pages in 2 columns, published in 1935. The page on the left is an entry on the titles on Shakespeare and shorthand. This precedes pretty much all English language publications on the subject. And just to share another slide about this, and this is from the Kislak collection, from the Furness collection. This is one of the key texts published in 1897, Shakespeare and the Beginnings of English Stenography, a contribution about the genesis of Shakespeare's plays, on which in pencil, we kind of hope it's Furness's own hand, we read, "An admirable scholarly work, most valuable." So the transmission of written composition, which is what the Shakespeare and shorthand arguments are all about. So the transmission of written composition is a peculiar and even paradoxical use of the technology. While shorthand in general is intended to record that which is being generated or produced on the spot, taking down a play from performance is an attempt to reconstruct an existing script at several removes. It is also our best chance To evaluate the efficacy of various shorthand systems in these instances, we have at least theoretically an existing original against which to compare the version mediated by shorthand note-taking. 17th century shorthand systems did not allow scribes to reach the speeds 19th and 20th century stenographers were capable of. And contemporary complaints about then contemporary complaints about the practice, as well as modern scholarly work on the products of shorthand note-taking, tend to emphasize how corrupt, or to be more generous, how approximate the results were. But the practice was widespread, and the fantasy of exact reproduction of speech through shorthand was an important part of the cultural imaginary. The very idea that the system of writing could serve not only for composition and storage, but also for verbatim recording seemed revolutionary. This was also why inventors represented shorthand as fundamentally different from other forms of writing. One 17th century shorthand manual insisted that the magic of stenography prevented words from vanishing in the air by turning them into ink. And another manual on my slide, of which we have actually a copy here, claimed that when watching the stenographer take notes, it looks as if words from the speaker's mouth dissolve to ink and fall upon the paper. This fantasy of inkjet style inscription anchors the promise of the accuracy of shorthand inscription into the idea of instantaneous and immediate recording. And so does the idea, the second half of the quote there, that the stenographer's quill was really a tongue. The signs on paper, the physical impressions left by the speaking tongue, speech. Writing is an art of memory. A scribe working in longhand needs to actively reproduce, and in that process, alter the language of their source. By contrast, and just like the telephone or the radio in the late 19th century, these 17th century advertisements promised the impression of speech onto paper, bypassing the transformative interventions of the writer's agency and memory. In this fantasy, shorthand is a kind of writing without a writer. Shorthand, of course, is in fact very heavily mediated. For any shorthand note to reach an audience beyond the note taker, it had to pass through longhand transcription and then through print. But as so often with new media, the hopes for the efficacy of the replacement of one mediating convention, orthography, with another, phonetic symbols, is figured as a kind of immediacy. When notes taken in shorthand were transcribed and then published in print, the work of the stenographer was sometimes highlighted on the title page or elsewhere in the text. The scribes who gained the most public attention were those stenographers who recorded political debates, trials, and scaffold speeches during the mid-17th century. When we think about the transformation and expansion of the public sphere around 1642, we primarily think about the eruption of printed pamphlets into the public sphere. But shorthand reporting was also an integral part of this discourse network, a technology for the recording of spoken utterance for circulation and often for print dissemination. Some trials and scaffold speeches had large audiences, which meant that the accuracy of transcriptions was subject to public scrutiny. To prevent any suspicion of editorial or other interference, the printed text might also purposely display signs of its spoken origins. The note to the reader in this 1650-51 publication puts this very clearly, and I quote from the slide, "This speech following is published in those very words that the gentleman delivered them. And though there be some abrupt breakings off and other expressions not so smooth as might have been, yet I could not with honesty alter the word." Glitches that could have been tidied up, noise that could have been reduced or eliminated became part of a textual performance, advertising the fidelity of the recording of the embodied utterance. And here's another example from another scaffold speech, where it is the speaker who interrupts himself when he observes the writers, as the note in the margin puts it, and comments on the unpremeditated nature of his own speech. So there is truly something that and here the original sentence breaks off and he comments, had I thought my speech would have been thus taken, I would have digested it into some better method than now I can, and shall desire these gentlemen that does write it, that they will not wrong me in it, and that it may not in this manner be published to my disadvantage. That in the printed quarter. We could say this is a moment of self-reflection, and not only of the speaker, but also of the apparatus for recording, reproduction, and dissemination, including the shorthand note, the longhand transcription, and the print publication. The trial of Charles I in January 1648-49 was the most sensational event of the revolutionized media environment of the mid-century. The King's trial produced what is among the most striking transcripts of spoken utterances published from shorthand notes. This apparently meticulous record of Charles's confused and ultimately blogged attempt to make a concluding statement uses typographical conventions familiar from early 17th century drama for the very similar representation of speech. The dialogue is not edited for coherence. That is to say, it is not adjusted to the norms of written language. This last page, we see an exchange of short, clipped, broken utterances, sometimes changing course mid-sentence until the dialogue fully disintegrates into repetitions of by your favor and sir, ineffectual requests that only show the breakdown of communication. Line breaks separate the speakers, each of whom is identified by italicized speech prefixes. Line breaks also indicate pauses between utterances of the same speaker, and a series of hyphens signal the moments when the king's words give out, while the physical gestures that exceed language presumably continue to try to communicate, only to then also give up. All of which is to say, the verisimilitude of the report is to a large extent an effect of the shorthand record being mediated through the conventions of printed drama. The typography and layout effectively turned the conclusion of the trial into a scene from a 17th century play, such as we have seen earlier. So to wrap up, I want to come back first to Johnson and Marston. If we look at the conversational glitches and breakdowns of the early 17th century stage alongside the print version of the shorthand record of the silencing of Charles Stuart, the formal similarities register the convergence of the new cultural technologies of playbook typography and shorthand note-taking as enabling and inspiring both of these remarkable textual phenomena. Is it not striking how in all these instances of embodied speech being registered in writing, it is the moments of silence when words fail that most clearly mark written language as originating in speech? And to come back second to modernist media and art, I want to conclude by noting that the analogy between the effects of modern and early modern media constellations, between what Friedrich Kittler called the discourse network of 1900 and the effects of what we may call the discourse network of 1600, is not merely the effect of our hindsight. This is not a Beckettian quote. The crack being the author. Trying to describe the mimetic effects of print can result in interesting metaphors. In 1914, George Philip Krapp argued that in the prose of his comedies, Johnson strove zealously to make his dialogue a faithful record of colloquial conversation. He was careful to reproduce photographically popular syntax and phonetics. And you remember how Joyce suggests that the sounds from the gramophone remind you of the voice, the way the photograph reminds you of the face at the end of that quote I put on the slide earlier. One actually wonders if the word photographically here is a typo for phonographically, or is it a conscious choice to highlight the visual medium? Another early 20th century writer went so far as to suggest that Ben Jonson preserves, as in a phonograph, the words and voice of the people of early modern London. Early 20th century literary criticism placed great importance both on the use of natural sounding language in contemporary writing and on the use of natural sounding language in early 17th century literature, using the same terms, the same concepts of both. It considered the informal conversational moments of early modern writing as the renewal or even revolution in literary language. This obsession with living speech was arguably triggered by the effects of the new media of the early 20th century. What I'm suggesting here is that some of the 20th century fascination with the literature around 1600 had to do with the effects of an earlier encounter between literature and new media, or between literature and new cultural techniques. This rich and wide-ranging critical discussion about living speech included Herbert Grierson, who in his famous and influential anthology of metaphysical poetry, published in 1921, claimed that Donne's harsh and rugged verse is an outcome of the desire to approximate poetic to direct, unconventional colloquial speech. And while Eliot and Grierson avoided making connections between the media technological a priori and literary phenomena, F.R. Leavis even gestures in that direction, although he points to a different medium, not shorthand or the telephone. Leavis's unpublished 1924 Cambridge PhD dissertation about journalism and its relationship to literature argued that what he calls Elizabethan journalism influenced literary writing by bringing it closer to the spoken word. By Elizabethan journalism, Leavis means anti-theatrical pamphlets and the Marprelate tract. For Leavis, journalism can be a source of literary renewal, and he traces it throughout English literary history from the Renaissance to the 20th century, precisely because it resembles the spoken word in being addressed to a particular audience at a particular moment, and as a result shares the vividness of the spoken word without, however, participating its evanescence, because it's recorded, it's printed. The different technologies of recording and transmission available in the early 20th and the early 17th centuries obviously enabled different modes of attention to speech and embodiment. Shorthand would hardly allow Marcel to reflect on the sweetness of his grandmother's voice. And yet, these two moments of fascination with speech are comparable, and I think mutually illuminating. They're also parts of a long history of the repeated discoveries of speech, and obviously the Romantics are very much part of this also. Each of these moments rewrite the media history they emerge from, and they make speech and writing new. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That was great. So the floor is open for questions. And if you have a question on Zoom, please feel free to put up the little hand and we will call on you. Yeah. Yeah, Liliana.
Thank you so much. It seems to me that you have discussed the relationship between the oral and the written in two directions, related but different. One is the documentation of oral speech, one is stenography or technological media. And the other, the imagination of what the oral should be like in dramas of the 17th century and so on. That means imitating speech on the stage. And these are very different points. And I wonder what would happen if I would put in the political issue. Because you were talking about Britain, you were talking about France and America in the more modern age, but you bracketed Germany. And in the late 18th century, when a young group of rebel rousers, now known as the Storm and Stress, tried to protest against the French drama played everywhere. They did not only protest against the Aristotelian unities and the rhyme, but that it was written. So the duplication of oral speech became the birth of German national literature. And they look precisely to 17th century English, because there they found what the French didn't do, and Shakespeare became Nordic, and then Henri German, and so on and so forth. So one cannot talk about German or literature without not political instance. Now I wonder, isn't what you are describing in some ways political too? Turning against Latin, turning against the extension, and so on and so forth. So not just that the German take the English for their national project, but also that the Italians or the British at that time are using the oral language also for political purposes.
Thank you. I mean, if I would be giving a very short answer to this, then I would just say yes. But there's but to elaborate. So a couple of points. So one is that, and as I was trying to like very quickly suggest at the end, I think what we're talking about here read, as it were, like discoveries and literary appropriations of speech and speech-like language again and again over literary history in various places, and also like repeatedly in specific literary traditions. So you have the German Sturm und Drang begins with this idea that you were describing, that we should approximate dramatic speech to spoken language and away from a certain kind of written and as you said, like that had kind of a national political function. But then also in Germany around the end of the 19th and especially the beginning of the 20th century, you see a different kind of modernist experimentation with the representation of noise and also of speech. So what I'm saying is like there are like various forms of this. Now the national, which you refer to as the political, it does often have a certain kind of political valence, like going to the language of the people away from kind of elite or establishment uses of language, and especially in France, there is like very clearly a sense of like, this is, if we go phonetic, that is about a move away from kind of Latinate formality and returning to the spoken roots of the French language. In this kind of shorthand moment that I'm highlighting, I don't see, there might be, but I don't see that kind of reach for the popular in the sense of the language of the people. Often what we find is there's much more kind of an individual and personally embodied interest that I'm noticing. Yeah, I mean, it's probably a misunderstanding what you were saying.
No, it is popular, but not, it is against the foreign. It's against the French. It is, right. Some of these strong and stressed people were pretty average aristocrats.
Right.
That was not the issue. But the other interesting thing is that a few years later, they ended up with their first place.
Right. So something similar is for something about this. The problem, the difference here is that some of the spellings that the English are struggling with are undeniably very English. So there is, on the one hand, and the kind of English spelling that they end up with just by the 17th century is kind of a mix of various things, and it is kind of etymological in its motivation, shall we say, or its rationale. But a lot of that is actually like reaching back to Middle English spellings. So to say that you are kind of straightening that out, you cannot actually say that what you're doing is removing English from from the foreign. Rather, what you're doing is, so they need to kind of find a different kind of ideology for this. And this is, I think, partly why it breaks down, because what happens in the English moment, unlike what is happening in the French moment, is not able to articulate itself as a political movement. I think that I never thought about it this way, but it's very helpful what you were saying. I think this is what is happening. And this is why English phonetic spelling reform fails. I mean, it's kind of maybe not true, but at least like a sharp sounding argument. The reason why English spelling reform fails is because it's not able to attach itself to a national ideology. I don't know if that, but on the other hand, kind of the connection between an interest in speech, in spoken language, and the study of language, phonetics, the connection between phonetics as a science and shorthand is very close and very intense. And there is a difference between German phonetics and English phonetics. The English focus being on articulatory phonetics, which is very closely connecting itself to shorthand practice and the analysis of speech as shorthand is already doing it, then ends up being kind of a subject of study, as it were. Whereas in Germany, kind of the direction is Helmholtz, and that's but
linguistics. They did it in Paris with the Sanskrit and others, not the German language. But the interesting thing, and I'm stopping now, is this paradox on which the discipline of linguistics rests, that it is studying an oral language.
Right.
And that's basically partly what you are talking about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Marissa, and then we have a question from Zoom.
Thank you. This is really exciting. I love the way you're bringing together these 20th century and 19th century media theorists and taking us on a journey through English shorthand that's really different than the other accounts I've seen. And I guess my question is about verse. So a lot of the examples you had seems to be prose, right? Like moments when, of course, like representative speech is one of the things. But it seems like some of the media theorists are interested in using this to understand verse as well as prose. And I wondered I wondered where your formal analysis might go with this, because I know that's something that the matter of your work another time, or is this really going to be a way that we're thinking about how prose works in drama and works in these other kinds of texts that are about recording an approximation of spoken practice?
Remind me what you mean by like verse being implicated in this. I'm just not.
Well, I was thinking about some of the final, like Eliot thinking about every revolution
in
poetry is actually return to common speech, right? In like Donne's style. Yeah, so 20th century people want it to be about verse, but I think what you're telling us is about prose. Right. So I wonder if you could kind of think.
Okay. No, it is. You're absolutely right. And what is actually interesting about Eliot and his contemporaries is that they reach for the spoken as a way to revolutionize poetry. So it's clear that what they are interested in is not this kind of very similar transcription. There are like moments of this. Ford Madox Ford has like things to say about how this would be a good idea, but this is not the direction where it goes. And it's interesting also to see how this thing peters out. And by the time we see like Eliot like talk about this in four quartets, that you wouldn't think of this as having to do with this kind of spokenness. And it's very interesting also how Eliot moves from thinking about Donne as the model figure to Dryden as the model for conversational English. I mean, that is hardly your, that is not something we would get, because for him, it's like, it's basically like polished conversational English. And for that, Dryden is key, but he moves away from what is radical about some of have done. So it's an interesting problem. And what is happening here is that this happens again and again, because also like what I was showing here, like what happens in early 17th century drama, it disappears by the 1620s. Like it's no longer like happening like this. There's this moment when there's like, oh, this is weird, we can do this. And then this is not how Messenger writes. So it's interesting how these revolutions happen again and again.
That's fascinating. But I would say another thing I was thinking about as we were talking, which connects to your last point, is that I have seen this in the play pamphlets from the Civil War, which are possibly doing stuff with the exact trial transcript body that you're talking about. So,
yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. I was very happy to see you here because your book is obviously like is an important connection there.
Isn't someone like Wordsworth kind of fit in?
Right.
Representing the speech of the humble.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. So this is so this is kind of an ideology and something that kind of occurs again and again in different forms. This is somewhat more radical looking than what we find in Wordsworth, but.
We have a question on Zoom. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Is that me?
That's you.
Okay, yes. Hi, my name's Kelly McKay. I'm actually finishing.
I really liked your article.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I really liked your talk. I'm finishing my dissertation on 17th. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I'm just finishing up my dissertation on 17th century shorthand, and this just gave me so much food for thought, and I really, really enjoyed, especially the connections with modernist theory. I also I found it very refreshing that you weren't talking about shorthand as a vehicle for transcription of plays, because you're right, that's been done to death, and we can await manuscript evidence. But one thing that I was wondering is, I think you did a really nice job of showing that what shorthand is and what shorthand was said to be are two slightly different things. You know, it isn't a successful method of verbatim recording, but they sure talk about it as if it is in the manuals. And I was wondering if the relationship that you're finding between shorthand as a media technology and this more lifelike portrayal of dialogue, if you think that it's more connected to shorthand the technology, or shorthand the sort of idea of a technology that, if perfect, could do this stuff. Because the manuals are fairly clear, so far as I understand it, that you're not supposed to record the noise. You know, you're supposed to record as little as possible so that you can be almost as verbatim as possible. But, you know, you're not supposed to have any repetition. So the FFF repetition that you had in the dialogue would not come up in shorthand. So I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that.
No, you're absolutely right about this. I mean, I would say that, of course, even in situations where the shorthand record is attempting to replicate all the glitches, as in like some of those scaffold speeches, that kind of what I'm just doing right now is not there. So that kind of vocalization doesn't appear, and even though the kind of how the sentences go wrong does show up. Two more things about this. I mean, one is that when they're recording, oops, you disappeared. When they're recording scaffold speeches, oh, someplace else. They are, we see that multiple people are working, right? So what we can assume is that they're conflating their notes, and that's a way for them to approximate, like, you know, what was said. But still, you're absolutely right. So I am kind of combining these two things. Obviously, there is shorthand that is being used, and then as people use shorthand, they realize kind of what is the utopian possibility that is being promised. And I think it's a combination of these two things, because my argument is not so much that dramatists around 1605 are imitating shorthand transcriptions. We don't actually have that much from that moment that they could possibly have been imitating, right? That survives at least. But that the potential of shorthand actually was something that alerted them to a formal possibility. My point is that shorthand alerted them and made them aware of how you can also hear speech. So yes, thanks. That's kind of very helpful to clarify. Yeah.
Let's go to Whitney.
Thanks. I'm interested in the question of it as a media technology, and I'm wondering about what other things need to be in place to make shorthand viable as a recording.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about Kelly's comment just now, and also like Pizza's diary is shorthand, but he's not recording things. Yeah. Using it, he's like encoding his diary in shorthand. Not saying he's saying aloud. Yeah. Right. So it has this life beyond recorded sound.
Absolutely.
But if we kind of bracket that and just look at it as a technology for recording, like you need to have a writing implement that can travel with you if you're at a speech, right? Like you're not going to take your little Zoom, your little inkwell, and dip it, so like what's the scene of a shorthand recording? Like paper, or are you using like a tablet, or I don't know if you come across anything about that.
I think if maybe like Kelly wants to help me here, but my understanding is that we kind of tend to assume that it's a tablet and lead or some similar kind of thing that you're using, and as a result, I mean, there's like limits to how long. And it's interesting because like one of the ways they advertise shorthand in these manuals is like how little space something in shorthand takes up, which is kind of a relevant question. If you have endless amounts of paper, then that's not so much a concern. But if they say like, well, you just need like a single sheet to have like this much. So that indicates that, yes, that's actually an issue. But if you have like, you know, like a 10 tablet little kind of whatever, then you can actually like take down a fair amount of text on that, I would assume. But yeah, like inkwells are not really.
So the shortening of it is a function of the technological.
It's part of it, but also it's like speed and space. Yeah, I think.
I mean, linked to that is some of the pictures you had of the manuals of phonetic orthography are interesting too, because of the way that they are like trying to repurpose all kinds of pieces of type that might be available in a print shop. You know, they can't just make up. There you're constrained. The shorthand writer can make up those lines however they want, but they're constrained by, presumably they're not cutting whole new pieces of type for those.
They are.
They are awesome.
So there are two ways these shorthand manuals operate. It increasingly becomes a copperplate situation, and there is like an 18th century shorthand manual that is the entire book is copperplates, except like the first gathering. It's out here, the Western.
Which has some good images, theoretical images of these things happening in courts and the law courts, and there's a play, you know.
And I neglected to take pictures of that for, this was like not, I wasn't exactly, yeah, but it could have been useful. But so that's one way this can happen. But then in the Shelton, which was probably the most successful, went through very many editions. Pepys is using a modified version of Shelton, as I understand it. And in Shelton's manuals, there are copperplate leaves, but then there are explanations where it must be wood or you know, whatever you do with pieces of lead, but it is definitely, and they're not like, there's like no casting happening because the same characters look different. So they're like uniquely, so somebody's carving stuff. But they do. So that's kind of interesting. And of course, it would be interesting for someone to, which I'm not going to do, but if somebody wants to kind of look through all the editions of Shelton and check whether they are reusing those. They're reusing the copper plates, but whether they're reusing those bits is an interesting question.
The other side is you have a standard that's being proliferated for it to be
right.
Right?
Well, it's interesting again, yes, but it's also interesting like what happens to, because there are all these competing shorthand systems throughout history, and that is actually a problem because there are shorthand systems that like parallel running shorthand systems, and then somebody can use one but not the other. Like a famous case, which is obviously off topic here, but my understanding is that the big biography of Carl Schmitt, the biographer ran into the problem of Schmidt's notebooks. You know this story, like Schmitt kept like notebooks in shorthand. He was a trained jurist, and he wrote a particular kind of shorthand. And the biographer was at a certain point saying that the problem is that they only got to the 30s, and the guy is 90, and he's the only person he could find who could read it. So, and that's because that's kind of a particular kind. Competing shorthand systems is what this is. And of course, like certains take off, and then there are reprints. This is like Shelton has a bunch, but then there are others that have like one edition and then they die off. The other thing is the reason why this is because shorthand is usually the way it works is that you take shorthand notes and then you transcribe it in longhand. So, and then that eliminates the shorthand note. That's not what usually people kind of sit around reading, although by the 19th century, they also do that. They publish shorthand written stuff, where it becomes like interesting.
I saw Thomas Ward had his hand up. I don't know if your question is still.
He is. I see him. I totally see him.
Am I there? So, yeah, hi. Well, the hand kept going up and down because you kept sort of, people would raise points and then you said something which sort of answered my question. So, I mean, maybe what I'll just sort of say is, I mean, the thought that's kind of buzzing around in my head is that in a way, what you're making me think about is that shorthand sets up a new kind of set of negotiations about what counts as noise and what counts as sort of meaningful noise. I think it was, was it Kelly who was talking about how actually, I mean, that you don't actually want in shorthand to record noise, but that in creating that imperative to only record what is significant, the opportunity sort of presents itself to record. And so I was like really struck by the example that you gave from the King's trial, that the noise or the sort of interruptions in fluent speech become sort of meaningful as I mean, the way in which the king's, the monarch, the sort of regnal line is being interrupted, and so I'm not sure that there's really a question there, just to sort of think about how shorthand is putting new pressure on the question of what counts as noise versus meaningful speech.
I mean, I would, again, like, this is one of those questions where I'm saying, like, yes, this is like a very helpful and clear reformulation of something that I've been kind of struggling to articulate. But yes, that's exactly what's happening, and that's kind of an answer to Kelly's question. Yeah.
Okay. Gary says, one of shorthand's most notable features is conspicuous failure, particularly in the transcription of shorthand into longhand, which all the best shorthand writers said should be done promptly, while the context could still be reconstructed.
Yep.
Is the inevitability of spectacular failure central to the cultural meaning of shorthand? And then he has another thing, but I'll let you do that.
Oh, that's awesome. And I think, like, yes, this is kind of the competition that is going on. On the one hand, people are constantly recognizing, trying to kind of, gesture in this direction. But yes, that's especially in the 17th century, it's constant and almost absolute failure in some regards. That on the one hand. On the other hand, again, like for some bizarre reason, it occurred to me to call it the utopian promise. is creating that pressure that Thomas was talking about. So these two things are working from like maybe like two ends of the spectrum, and some of them create these resonances, shall we say.
But that,
May I ask a follow-up? Can I be heard?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Gary.
Okay. May I ask a follow-up? The reason I was asking was because in the 19th century, a lot of the concerns about shorthand, I'm thinking here particularly of like John Payne Collier's Shakespeare, John Payne Collier, who was a newspaper reporter who used shorthand and who's writing about relations of Shakespeare to shorthand of the kind you've kind of referred to, were very much shaped by, maybe over-determined by his experience as a reporter for the Times and the Morning Chronicle. And it always seems to me that one of the things, that this is a general comment about 19th century thing about the cultural meanings of shorthand, how much of it has to do with the emphasis on how it fails, on how it is, the guy said rapier, and you wrote down just the consonants and you reconstructed it as reaper. In other words, the cultural meaning of the 19th century, the thing it means as a metaphor, more often concerns the failure of it. I think that plays a role actually in the role that like the shorthand issues play up in like 19th century and later Shakespeare criticism. Just wanted to throw that in.
No, that's a wonderful point. I also wonder what Collier's own experience and training in shorthand is like, and the shorthand system he's using, and how that compares to what becomes dominant at second half of the 19th century, the Gregg and the Pitman shorthands, which are more emphatically kind of phonetic, like actually quite radically so. And where I think, because they stopped doing these like very rigid kind of symbols, and speed becomes like much more possible, and there's like a certain kind of fluency where I think the quality of transcription like radically improves. And by like 1900, the earlier issues are maybe less present, but somebody who actually knows about shorthand should talk about this and not me.
But I think, just to add, by the way, we have some of Collier's shorthand
notebook on the table, yes.
Transcription of Coleridge's lectures on Shakespeare on the table.
And a shout out that I would like to, I think Gary, I'm glad you came, Gary, and Andras, and maybe Zach, should work on these notebooks, which have been in a long time and never really been fully unpacked. And Gary's looked at them before, and write up something about them, about that.
But I just want to add, I think that actually the failure, your point is that the new technology of stenography makes audible speech in a new way, in the same way that the gramophone, in a way, the failure is actually going to produce that even more, because it produces, it's the lack of fidelity that produces this desire for fidelity. So, in the same way, once you get CD, I remember when CDs, came out, and suddenly everyone could hear all this stuff on LPs that we never cared about before, including the static and the hum and the sound the needle makes when it hits the record, right? Which was noise before, now was signal, So I think or MP3s, which, strip away a lot of sound, the lossiness of those media. You might say that stenography is like a very lossy technology, right? Like it's that more than any success it has. That would, I could see producing the kind of Johnson, Marston, idea that we could do this. We could actually do it in the scripted way, in a way that you can't do it in the transcript.
That's a good way of putting it.
This is wonderful, Andras. Just a couple of observations, maybe. One is, as we speak about stenography and stenographic practice, it seems to me that something switched very much about it in the 20th century in secretarial practice, where, in mid-century, the largely female secretaries were using shorthand to take down dictation. So that is the embodied speech of their supervisors. And then their task was to clean it up when they put it into letter form, into written form. So that seems to be a kind of decisive shift. The other, maybe just observation, is getting back to Charles I and the ways in which the accurate transcription of embodied speech has political weight. That is, Charles is made to look incompetent because he's hemming and hawing and not getting words out, or maybe pathetic. But I'm thinking of. I don't think that it's just me projecting, but the way that the New York Times in its reporting will use the accurate transcription of speech politically, in that, going back to the Bush administration, W was always saying things that would end up being nonsensical, and the Times would print the full sentence, the full non-grammatical sentence. And they did the same thing with Trump, obviously.
Yeah.
And I suspect they did not do that with Obama because, of course, editorial practice would allow you to put in ellipses or just end the sentence where you want it to, right? So that, again, is just a modern example, I think, where the verbatim recording of speech has real political weight.
This is wonderful and a great point. I would, however, suggest that what is happening in the case of Charles is something more complicated, because what is happening here is that Charles is trying to get in, just say something, and he's constantly being stopped. And in the end, he says something that if this is the attention I'm getting, what justice other people are going to have? And that is a sentence that's there. So it's a performance of somebody being silenced aggressively and cruelly, and then this is printed and circulated. And of course, that's a reason why, no, this was accurate. This is what happened. This is exactly, because that is a plausible, yeah. But it's a version. It's a version of the same. It's just with a, yeah.
Thanks for both having this opportunity to ask a question. There is an underlying or overarching philosophy behind the shorthand in this field of English literature. However, I wonder if in 20th century or modern contemporary scholars compared it to what happened in the Philippines. Because in the Ottoman context, they were using Arabic and Arabic alphabet. Actually, Arabic was pretty much functioned as shorthand, right? The vowels were not. It makes learning and writing Turkish very difficult, because in Turkish you cannot make any word without the vowels. So with the Republic, it was quite possible as well. They switched to the phonetic alphabet, and actually it did the opposite. By switching to a phonetic alphabet, the words became longer because vowels are visible now. But reading and learning is a lot easier. This will serve the functional purpose of very well. But there is that discussion of reaching and achieving sort of a pure, perfect language. It goes back to Socrates, right? Because for obvious reasons, they wanted to or dreamed about a perfect language that could capture the ideas and the word concepts as they are. But in Turkey, we are still talking about raw parts. So, the death of the author, reaching perfect language. So, phonetic language doesn't resolve those questions. Actually, those questions still sit there. Authenticity, the writer's role, the truth. Do people talk about this? Any sources that you can bring us to?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm going to answer your question, but I have thoughts. So, a couple of things. I mean, one is just off the top of my head, it's really what you said about Arabic that can function. I mean, it's just it's quite remarkable how Arabic writing is very much kind of, shall we say, designed for handwriting. And it is, I have no idea, but my sense is that it's probably just much more, it's especially dropping the vowels, it's actually it looks something that is much faster than to write the cursive hand in a Latin alphabet, etc. But more to the point, the phonetic and ideal languages. I mean, there's this split in the 17th century where, on the one hand, you have actually shorthand-ish kind of ideas of plans for an ideal symbolic language. that is actually independent of specific languages, that is purely conceptual, and as a result, it can be the foundation for a universal language. And so that is happening in the 17th century, parallel with this, but the opposite end, where you find this absolutely radical, purely phonetic, whatever it sounds like. And the latter turns out to be easier to use in everyday transactions. Also, if you try to develop a system of symbols for concepts that is actually covering all areas of human experience, you're going to end up with like an enormous alphabet. There is always in the 17th century, this is a conversation also that include like references, comparisons with China and Chinese writing, whatever their understanding of that was. So that would be my kind of response to this, that it's kind of a really complicated history where this is like only one direction. How this kind of relates to the problem of authorship is something that we could like chat about. I would need to think about like how that works.
Thanks. This is so much fun. Thank you, Andras. I already did one shout out to Gary's work on Collier. Second shout out to a student of ours, Sarah Bernstein, who I think is on the Zoom.
Saw her name, yeah.
Great work on James Weston in the 18th century. And one of the things she pointed out in her essay, I mean, she was looking into the rival systems, there are so many. And Weston, whose book is all engraved, was at pains to assure his readers that tradespeople endorsed his methods, and his subscribers include people a little lower down the social scale than you might assume, which is interesting, and I don't know what to make of that exactly in terms of, you know, the question of like social status and writing. But I was using Sarah's observation maybe to tie in a little bit to Gary's question. It seemed to me that, going back to where you started your talk, I see a difference in terms of the impact of the shorthand methodologies on the one hand and the play texts on the other, because I was just thinking of Mark Twain and the use of dialect in the 19th century. So the dialect in writing has often at least a profoundly satirical, mocking. I mean, humorous, yes, but beyond humor to problematic, let's just say, even nasty tones. And I wonder, that seems important here.
Absolutely.
Your play text moments we're supposed to laugh at characters whose speech is being represented so closely. Right. It's a little bit like the Times in a way, but maybe less political. I don't know.
Maybe less political, but maybe like actually like even we would find it as like disturbingly offensive.
So it's almost like the closer you get, the more humor, to real speech, the less you want, so
it's absolutely. I mean, it's about not being in control. And of course, like for somebody like Johnson, it's very obvious that if you are not able to control your mouth fully, and that means all sorts of things like bodily, but also in terms of dialect, but also in terms of your syntax, even like whatever versions of that, you are risible. You are so this is very clearly, this is not some kind of a neutral screen of that is happening here. And so this is kind of an important difference, that like what we see here between like the kind of the Sturm und Drang moment and
ideal here.
There is absolutely no ideal here. What you see, and even when you have dialect being represented, like that's usually also like at least the minimum is condescension, right? That you have Scottish, Irish, Welsh, even, and then you have like people speaking with a heavy French accent, people with a heavy Dutch accent. You have these things, and that's always like they are challenged somehow. Is what we see there. That is the minimum, and then of course like you have like you're being laughed at.
And the implications of that are interesting. Like the closer you get to realistic representation.
Kelly has another question if there's time.
There's time. Why don't we give Kelly the last question?
Oh, that's too kind. I was going to ask the question that you asked to be asked in your talk, and I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on why England and why England in particular. Something
that's very kind of you, and that shows how attentive you are. No, thank you. I really appreciate this. This is I think this is kind of a difficult question because the way, like, how do we talk about this? What is this strange insularity of English, which I think is like a historical fact, that this new type of alphabetic phonetic shorthand is, like, in the 17th century, a fundamentally English insular phenomenon. So why? And I mean, there might be all sorts of cultural factors, and of course, kind of like a very literate culture, clearly, like, is a prerequisite. Like a culture, not so much literate, but a culture where written transactions are like essential and important. So like that is kind of a background against which this happened. But then there is something else. And that is something that, I mean, I don't know enough about, but my sense is that people who study the connections and differences between how languages, like orthographies of particular languages, represent or reflect the spoken language, tend to kind of argue that what we have in English is probably at one of the extremes of the in terms of orthography being quite distant from the sound of language. Probably at one extreme, at an extreme from of like, if you come up with a scale, and languages that Italian is like much closer. I mean, there's much less issue. I mean, people who have practically no Italian can, like, reasonably easily kind of read an Italian, like spell out an Italian text. I can promise you that Hungarian is very similar to that. There are, like, and it kind of has like various reasons why this is the case. But English being so far, and actually further than pretty much anything else in the Latin alphabet world, might be something that creates extra pressure on writing. So I don't know if this makes sense, but my point is that kind of like at least the phonetic simplification and streamlining might be something that, like, in English is at least like a potential direction to go, whereas you wouldn't need to bother with this in some other languages. Does that?
Yes, thank you so much.
And there's also like just like the extent to which this is the case is quite remarkable. How, like, early shorthand systems often, like, are taking, like, in the late 17th century, they're explicitly taking English as their model, and yet they don't take off because the need is somehow less there.
Okay, I think we should stop there and thank Andras.
Thank you, guys.
They can get Lila can save the chat.